What kind of man kills his own brother? What kind of uncle crosses the ultimate line with his brother's daughter? These are the questions that haunted the small town of Cedar Falls, Iowa, in the summer of 2019, when a family barbecue turned into a crime scene that would tear apart not just one family, but an entire community. If you're new to The Only Witness, welcome to our channel where we dive deep into the most shocking true crime cases that have rocked America. Make sure to hit that like button and subscribe with notifications on, because you won't want to miss any of our investigations into the darkest corners of human nature. The story I'm about to tell you involves betrayal so deep, secrets so dark, and a family so dysfunctional that it reads like something out of a twisted novel. But this isn't fiction. This is the true story of the Morrison family, where blood wasn't thicker than water, and where the man who was supposed to protect became the predator. Our story begins on a sweltering July afternoon in 2019. The Morrison family was gathering for their annual summer barbecue at the home of patriarch Robert Morrison, a 54-year-old construction foreman who had built his life around two things: his family and his reputation in the community. Robert was what you'd call a man's man: broad shoulders, calloused hands, and a voice that could command attention in any room. He'd been married to his wife, Susan, for 28 years, and together they had raised 3 children: Michael, 26, Sarah, 24, and their youngest, Emma, who had just turned 19. The Morrison house sat on 2 acres of well-manicured land on the outskirts of Cedar Falls, complete with a wraparound porch and a backyard that was perfect for hosting family gatherings. Robert took pride in that house. He'd built most of it himself, working weekends and evenings after his regular construction jobs. It represented everything he believed in: hard work, family values, and the American dream. But on this particular July day, that dream was about to become a nightmare. Robert's younger brother, Danny, had driven up from Des Moines for the barbecue. Danny Morrison was 48 years old, divorced twice, and worked sporadically as a freelance contractor. Where Robert was solid and dependable, Danny was charming and unpredictable. He had the kind of easy smile that made people trust him, even when they probably shouldn't. The brothers had always had a complicated relationship. Robert was the responsible older brother who did everything right, while Danny was the free spirit who seemed to coast through life on charm and luck. The barbecue started like any other family gathering. Robert fired up his massive grill, the one he'd custom-built from steel plates he'd salvaged from a demolition job. Susan bustled around the kitchen, preparing her famous potato salad and cornbread. The grandparents were there: Robert and Danny's parents, Jim and Martha, both in their 70s but still spry enough to enjoy these family get-togethers. Various aunts, uncles, and cousins filled out the crowd, about 20 people in total. Emma Morrison was the star of the day, having just finished her freshman year at the University of Northern Iowa with a perfect 4.0 GPA. She was studying pre-med with dreams of becoming a pediatric surgeon. Emma was beautiful in that fresh-faced, all-American way: blonde hair, blue eyes, and a smile that could light up a room. More importantly, she was smart, ambitious, and had her whole life mapped out ahead of her. But Emma Morrison was carrying a secret that would destroy everything. For the first few hours, everything seemed normal. Robert held court by the grill, flipping burgers and telling stories about his latest construction projects. Danny entertained the kids with magic tricks, the same ones he'd been doing since Robert's children were small. Susan made sure everyone had enough to eat and drink. It was picture-perfect Americana. The first sign that something was wrong came around 4 p.m. Emma, who had been the life of the party all day, suddenly became quiet and withdrawn. She kept glancing nervously at her Uncle Danny, and several family members noticed that she seemed uncomfortable whenever he was nearby. Susan Morrison, being the observant mother she was, picked up on her daughter's mood immediately. "Emma, honey, are you feeling all right?" Susan asked, finding her daughter alone on the back porch, staring out at the cornfields that stretched to the horizon. Emma forced a smile. "I'm fine, Mom. Just tired from finals week." But Susan knew her daughter better than that. Emma had been acting strange for weeks ever since she'd come home from college. She'd been distant, moody, and had lost weight. Susan had attributed it to the stress of her rigorous pre-med program, but now she wondered if something else was going on. The second sign came during dinner. The family had gathered around the long picnic table that Robert had built the previous summer. Danny was sitting directly across from Emma, and throughout the meal, he kept making comments that seemed innocent enough to everyone else but made Emma visibly uncomfortable. "Emma's really grown up, hasn't she?" Danny said to Robert, raising his beer bottle in a mock toast. "I remember when she was just a little girl playing with dolls. Now look at her, a real woman." Robert beamed with pride at what he thought was his brother's compliment about his daughter's maturity. "She's something special, that's for sure. Going to be a doctor someday." But Emma's face had gone pale, and she was staring down at her untouched plate of food. Her hands were trembling slightly as she reached for her water glass. The third sign, the one that finally triggered the explosion that would end in violence, came during dessert. Susan had made her famous apple pie, and as she was serving slices, Danny reached over to help himself to extra whipped cream. "You know what they say?" Danny grinned, looking directly at Emma. "Life's too short not to have a little something sweet on the side." To everyone else, it seemed like an innocent comment about dessert, but Emma shot up from her chair so fast that her water glass toppled over, sending ice water cascading across the picnic table. "I need to use the bathroom," she mumbled, and practically ran into the house. Robert looked confused. "What's gotten into her?" Susan followed her daughter inside, her maternal instincts on high alert. She found Emma in the upstairs bathroom, sitting on the edge of the bathtub with her head in her hands, sobbing. "Emma, what's wrong? You've been acting strange all day." Emma looked up at her mother with tears streaming down her face. "Mom, I don't know how to tell you this." Susan sat down beside her daughter and put her arm around her shoulders. "You can tell me anything, sweetheart. You know that." And then, in a voice barely above a whisper, Emma Morrison told her mother the truth that would destroy their family forever. "Uncle Danny, he's been coming to my dorm room. For months. Ever since February. He said if I told anyone, he'd make sure I got kicked out of school. He said no one would believe me anyway." The words hit Susan Morrison like a physical blow. For a moment, she couldn't breathe, couldn't think, couldn't process what her daughter had just told her. Then the full horror of the situation crashed over her like a tsunami. "What do you mean, coming to your dorm room?" Susan's voice was shaking. Emma couldn't look at her mother. He said he was helping me with my car payments. He said it was just our little secret. But it wasn't. It wasn't help. Mom, he was forcing me. Every week, sometimes twice a week. He has a key somehow. He'd just show up." Susan Morrison felt her world crumble around her. Her brother-in-law, the man her husband trusted, the man who had been coming to family gatherings for years, had been sexually abusing her daughter. Her brilliant, beautiful daughter who was supposed to be living the college dream, who was going to be a doctor, who had her whole future ahead of her. "How long?" Susan whispered. "Since February. 5 months." Emma was crying so hard she could barely speak. "I tried to stop it. I tried to tell him no. But he's so much stronger than me, and he said he'd ruin everything for me if I fought back. He said he'd tell everyone I was a slut who was trading sex for money. He said he'd tell Daddy that I was on drugs. He said he'd make sure I lost my scholarship." Susan Morrison's hands were shaking with rage. "We have to tell your father." "No!" Emma grabbed her mother's arm. "Mom, please. You can't tell Daddy. You know how he is. You know what he'll do." And Emma was right. Susan knew exactly what her husband would do if he found out that his brother had been sexually abusing their daughter. Robert Morrison was not a man who solved problems with words. He was a man of action, and his actions tended to be decisive and permanent. But as Susan looked at her broken daughter, she realized that some secrets were too big to keep. Some violations were too serious to handle quietly. This wasn't just about family dynamics or keeping the peace. This was about a predator who had systematically abused a young woman for months, using her love for her family and her fear of consequences to keep her silent. "Emma, we have to report this to the police." "I can't, Mom. I can't go through all that. Having to tell strangers what he did to me. Having it in the newspapers. Having everyone at school find out." Emma was hyperventilating now. "Please, can't we just make him leave? Tell him we know and that he has to stay away?" Susan held her daughter close, her mind racing. Every instinct she had as a mother was screaming for justice, for punishment, for protection. But she also knew that Emma was right about the consequences of going public. In a small town like Cedar Falls, This kind of scandal would follow Emma for the rest of her life. If you're enjoying this deep dive into one of the most disturbing family crime cases we've ever covered, make sure you're subscribed to The Only Witness and hit that notification bell. We're just getting to the part where everything falls apart, and trust me, you won't want to miss what happens next. While Susan and Emma were having their devastating conversation upstairs, the family barbecue continued outside. Robert was cleaning the grill, joking with his cousins about the upcoming football season. Danny was helping clear the table, playing the role of the helpful brother-in-law. The grandparents were settling into lawn chairs for their afternoon nap. Everything looked normal from the outside. But normal was about to become a memory. Susan finally convinced Emma to splash cold water on her face and try to compose herself. They agreed that they would wait until after the barbecue to figure out what to do next. Emma would stay close to her mother for the rest of the day, and they would make sure she was never alone with Danny. When they came back outside, Robert immediately noticed that something was wrong. His wife's face was pale and tight, and Emma looked like she'd been crying. "Everything okay?" he asked Susan quietly. "We'll talk later," Susan replied, giving him a look that he'd learned over 28 years of marriage meant serious conversation coming, but not now. Robert nodded and went back to his hosting duties, but he kept watching his wife and daughter throughout the rest of the afternoon. Something was definitely wrong, and Robert Morrison was not a man who let things slide. The barbecue wound down around 6 p.m. The older relatives headed home first, followed by the cousins with young children. Soon it was just the immediate family: Robert, Susan, Emma, Michael, Sarah, and Danny. Michael and Sarah were both busy with their own lives and relationships, so they said their goodbyes and headed back to their respective apartments in town. That left Robert, Susan, Emma, and Danny sitting around the now quiet backyard, the sun setting behind the cornfields, painting everything in shades of gold and red. Danny was in no hurry to leave. He opened another beer and settled back in his chair, regaling Robert with stories about his latest construction jobs in Des Moines. Emma sat as far away from him as possible, practically glued to her mother's side. Susan was barely participating in the conversation, giving one-word answers and checking the time every few minutes. Robert, meanwhile, was growing more suspicious by the minute. His wife was clearly upset about something, his daughter looked terrified, and the dynamic between Emma and Danny seemed off. Danny kept making comments about Emma, how mature she'd become, how pretty she was, how proud Robert should be of her. Comments that would have seemed like normal uncle-to-niece praise just hours earlier now seemed to have an undercurrent that made Robert's skin crawl. Around 8 p.m., Susan couldn't take it anymore. "Danny, I think it's time for you to head home," she said abruptly, standing up and starting to collect the empty beer bottles. Danny looked surprised. "Oh, come on, Susan. The night's still young. Robert and I were just getting caught up." "Susan's right," Robert said, still not sure why his wife was so eager to end the evening but trusting her judgment. "It's getting late, and you've got that long drive back to Des Moines." Danny finally took the hint and started gathering his things. But as he was preparing to leave, he did something that sent Emma into a complete panic. He walked over to where she was sitting and leaned down to give her what appeared to be an innocent goodbye hug. But as he embraced her, he whispered something in her ear that made her entire body go rigid with fear. "This doesn't change anything," he whispered, so quietly that only Emma could hear. "I'll see you next week at your dorm. Same time, same place, and you won't say anything to anyone because you know what will happen if you do." Emma tried to pull away, but Danny held the hug a moment longer than necessary, his grip tight enough to leave marks on her arms. When he finally let her go, Emma stumbled backward and would have fallen if Susan hadn't caught her. "Emma!" Susan exclaimed. "Are you all right?" Emma couldn't speak. She was hyperventilating, tears streaming down her face, her whole body shaking. The combination of having to relive her trauma by telling her mother and then having Danny threaten her again right in front of her family was too much for her to handle. I can't. Emma couldn't form complete sentences. She ran into the house, leaving her parents and uncle standing in shocked silence. Danny played it off with a laugh. "College girls. You know how they are. Probably just tired from all that studying." But Robert Morrison was no fool. He'd watched his brother whisper something to his daughter, seen his daughter's extreme reaction, and noticed his wife's barely contained fury. The pieces of a very ugly puzzle were starting to come together in his mind. "What did you say to her?" Robert's voice was dangerously quiet. "Nothing, Bob. Just told her to keep up the good work in school." "Bullshit." Robert stepped closer to his brother. "What did you say to my daughter that made her run away crying?" Danny shrugged, still playing innocent. "I have no idea why she's being so dramatic. Kids these days are so sensitive." Robert looked toward the house where he could hear Emma sobbing and Susan trying to comfort her. Then he looked at his brother, and something cold and hard settled in his chest. "I think you need to leave now." Danny held up his hands in mock surrender. Fine. I can take a hint. I'll call you next week, and maybe we can figure out what's got everyone so worked up." "Don't call me," Robert said flatly, "and don't come back here." Danny's easy smile faltered for just a moment, but then he shrugged again. "Your call, big brother. But you might want to ask yourself why you're choosing to believe whatever story that girl is telling over your own blood." The way Danny said "that girl," with casual dismissal and something that sounded almost like contempt, made Robert's hands clench into fists. But he controlled himself. Barely. Danny got in his pickup truck and drove away, leaving Robert standing alone in his backyard, surrounded by the debris of what had been a normal family gathering just hours earlier. Robert went into the house to find Susan sitting on their bed, holding Emma while their daughter sobbed into her shoulder. "Someone needs to tell me what the hell is going on," Robert said, closing the bedroom door behind him. Susan looked at her husband, and he could see 28 years of marriage in her eyes, the trust, the love, but also the fear. She was afraid of what he would do when he learned the truth. "Robert, you need to promise me something first." "What?" "You need to promise me that you won't do anything crazy, that we'll handle this the right way." Robert felt ice water run through his veins. "Handle what the right way?" Susan took a deep breath, and then she told her husband everything that Emma had told her. Every detail of Danny's months-long campaign of sexual abuse. Every threat he'd made to keep Emma silent. Every violation of trust. Every instance of rape. Every moment of terror that their daughter had endured. Robert Morrison listened to his wife's words, but he felt like he was hearing them from underwater. The room seemed to tilt around him as the full scope of his brother's betrayal became clear. Danny hadn't just hurt Emma once. He'd been systematically abusing her for months. He'd been using Robert's trust, the family's love, and Emma's fear to continue his predatory behavior. And he'd done it all while sitting at Robert's table, drinking Robert's beer, and playing the role of the caring uncle. When Susan finished talking, the room was completely silent, except for Emma's quiet crying. Robert looked at his daughter, his brilliant, beautiful daughter who was going to be a doctor, who had never caused a moment of trouble in her life, who trusted her family to protect her. And he saw that she was broken. The light that had always shone in Emma's eyes was gone, replaced by fear and shame and trauma that would probably never fully heal. "How long did you say this has been going on?" Robert's voice was eerily calm. "Since February," Susan answered quietly. Robert did the math in his head. February to July. 5 months, 20 weeks. Danny had been coming to family gatherings during that entire time, looking Robert in the eye, shaking his hand, acting like the brother Robert had always believed him to be. "He was here for Easter dinner," Robert said, more to himself than to Susan and Emma. "Yes," Emma whispered. "And Mother's Day." "Yes." "And my birthday party in May." "Yes, Daddy." Robert stood up abruptly and walked to the window, looking out at his backyard where Danny had been sitting just 30 minutes earlier, drinking beer and acting like he didn't have a care in the world. "Robert," Susan said carefully, "we need to call the police." "No." Robert's voice was flat, emotionless. "We don't." "Robert, please, I know you're angry, but we have to handle this legally." Robert turned around, and Susan Morrison realized that in 28 years of marriage, she had never seen her husband look the way he looked right now. His eyes were empty, cold, like looking into the depths of a frozen lake. "He was in our house," Robert said quietly. "He sat at our table. He ate our food. He looked me in the eye and shook my hand while he was raping our daughter." "Daddy, please," Emma said, lifting her head from her mother's shoulder. "Please don't do anything that will make this worse." Robert walked over and knelt down beside the bed, taking his daughter's hands in his. "Emma, sweetheart, I need you to listen to me very carefully. This is not your fault. None of it is your fault. And I promise you that Danny will never hurt you again." There was something in the way he said it that made both Susan and Emma's blood run cold. "What are you going to do?" Susan asked, though she was afraid she already knew the answer. Robert stood up and kissed his wife on the forehead, then kissed Emma's tear-stained cheek. "I'm going to fix this." And with that, Robert Morrison walked out of the bedroom, down the stairs, and out to his garage. Susan could hear him moving around out there, the sound of metal against metal, tools being moved, equipment being gathered. She knew she should stop him, knew she should call the police herself, knew she should do something to prevent what was about to happen. But a part of her, the part that had watched her daughter suffer in silence for months, the part that had seen the fear in Emma's eyes every time Danny was around, the part that was consumed with rage at what had been done to her child, that part of her wanted Robert to do exactly what she knew he was planning to do. Outside, Robert loaded his pickup truck with very specific items: a shovel, a tarp, zip ties, and a .38 caliber revolver that he kept in a locked box for home protection. He also grabbed a burner cell phone he'd bought months earlier for a construction job but never used. Robert Morrison was a methodical man. When he built houses, he planned every detail in advance. When he solved problems, he thought through every possible complication. And when he decided that his brother needed to die, he approached it with the same systematic precision he brought to every other important task in his life. He used the burner phone to call Danny's cell phone. "Bob? What's up, brother? I thought we were done for the night." "We need to talk," Robert said. "Meet me at the old Hendricks farm. You know the place." The Hendricks farm was a piece of property about 10 miles outside of town that had been abandoned for decades. Robert and Danny had played there as kids, and later as teenagers, they'd gone there to drink beer and talk about girls. It was isolated, private, and far enough from any neighbors that no one would hear anything that happened there. "What do we need to talk about?" Danny asked, but there was something in his voice that suggested he already knew. "You know what?" There was a long pause on the other end of the line. "Bob, listen. If Emma said something to you, you need to understand that." 30 minutes, Robert cut him off. "Be there." Robert hung up the phone and drove out to the Hendricks farm, his mind completely focused on what needed to be done. He felt no anger anymore, no rage, no emotion at all. He felt like a surgeon preparing for a necessary operation. He got to the farm first and parked his truck behind the collapsed barn where it wouldn't be visible from the road. Then he waited. Danny arrived exactly 30 minutes later, just as Robert had known he would. Danny had always been punctual when it really mattered. Robert walked out to meet his brother as Danny was getting out of his pickup truck. "Bob, we need to talk about this rationally," Danny started, but Robert cut him off. "How long?" Robert asked. "How long what?" "How long have you been raping my daughter?" Danny's face went pale in the moonlight. "Bob, it's not what you think. So you're not going to deny it?" Danny looked around nervously, suddenly realizing how isolated they were, how far from help. "Look, Emma's not a kid anymore. She's 19. She's a grown woman who can make her own choices." "Her own choices?" Robert's voice was getting dangerously quiet again. "Is that what you call forcing yourself on her in her dorm room, threatening to ruin her life if she told anyone?" "She never said no," Danny said desperately. "Not really. And I helped her out with money for school, for her car. It was mutually beneficial." That was the moment when Robert Morrison snapped. The cold, calculating control he'd maintained since leaving the house shattered like glass, and 28 years of trust, love, and brotherhood exploded into pure homicidal rage. He pulled the .38 out of his jacket pocket and pointed it at his brother's chest. "You son of a bitch," Robert said, his voice shaking with fury. "She never said no. She's my daughter. She's a kid. And you were supposed to protect her, not prey on her." Danny raised his hands, backing away. "Bob, please, let's just calm down and talk about this." "Talk about what? About how you violated my daughter for 5 months while I trusted you? About how you sat at my table and looked me in the eye while you were destroying her life? About how you threatened her to keep her quiet? It wasn't like that, Danny was pleading now. I care about Emma. I would never hurt her. You raped her, Robert screamed, and the sound echoed across the empty farmland. You raped my daughter, and you made her too scared to tell anyone. Danny tried to run, but Robert was faster and stronger. He tackled his brother to the ground and they rolled in the dirt, fighting like they had when they were children, except this time it wasn't play. Robert was bigger and fueled by rage, and he quickly overpowered Danny. He pressed the gun against his brother's temple. Please, Bob, Danny was crying now. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. I'll leave town. I'll never come back. I'll never contact Emma again. Please don't do this. Robert looked down at his brother, the man who had been his best friend growing up, his best man at his wedding, the uncle who had taught Emma to ride a bicycle and had taken her to father-daughter dances when Robert was working late, the man who had betrayed everything that had ever mattered. You should have thought about that before you touched her, Robert said. And he pulled the trigger. The gunshot was extraordinarily loud in the quiet countryside, and then everything was silent except for the sound of Robert's heavy breathing and the distant chirping of crickets. Danny Morrison was dead. Robert sat beside his brother's body for almost an hour, not moving, not thinking, just processing what he had done. He had killed his own brother. He had committed murder. His life as he knew it was over. But as he sat there in the darkness, Robert found that he didn't regret it. Not for a second. Danny had destroyed Emma's life, had violated her trust, had used his position in the family to prey on an innocent young woman. Some crimes were too serious for the legal system to handle. Some violations demanded immediate and permanent justice. Robert wrapped Danny's body in the tarp he'd brought and buried him in a grave he dug 6 feet deep in the woods behind the old farmhouse. It took him most of the night, but Robert Morrison had been digging foundations and moving earth his entire career. He knew how to make sure something stayed buried. When he was finished, he scattered leaves and debris over the gravesite until it looked like undisturbed forest floor. Then he drove Danny's pickup truck to a lake about 20 miles away and rolled it into the water where it would never be found. Robert got home just as the sun was coming up. Susan was awake, sitting in the kitchen with a cup of coffee, waiting for him. She looked at her husband, at his dirty clothes, his scraped knuckles, his exhausted eyes, and she knew exactly what he had done. "Is it over?" she asked quietly. "It's over," Robert replied. Susan nodded once, then stood up and poured her husband a cup of coffee. They sat together at their kitchen table as the sunrise painted their backyard gold, and neither of them said another word about what had happened that night. If you've been following along with this incredible story of family betrayal and vigilante justice, you know we're approaching the climax of one of the most intense cases The Only Witness has ever covered. Make sure you're subscribed because you won't want to miss how this all plays out, and trust me, the ending is going to shock you. For the next 3 days, everything seemed almost normal. Emma was still traumatized, but knowing that Danny could never hurt her again seemed to lift some of the crushing weight she'd been carrying. She started eating again, started sleeping better, started talking about going back to school for her sophomore year. Robert went back to work, running his construction crew with the same steady competence he'd always shown. Susan returned to her job at the local library. To the outside world, the Morrison family appeared to be moving forward with their lives. But on Thursday morning, everything changed. Danny Morrison's ex-wife, Linda, called the Cedar Falls Police Department to report him missing. She explained that Danny was supposed to pick up their teenage son for a camping trip on Tuesday, but he'd never shown up and wasn't answering his phone. This was completely unlike Danny, who, whatever his flaws as a husband, had always been reliable when it came to his children. The police took the report and began a routine missing person investigation. They went to Danny's apartment in Des Moines and found that his bed hadn't been slept in since Sunday night. His neighbors said they'd seen him leave on Sunday morning with an overnight bag, saying he was going to visit his brother in Cedar Falls. The police called Robert Morrison. "Mr. Morrison, we're investigating the disappearance of your brother Daniel. When was the last time you saw him?" Robert's voice was steady, controlled. "He was at our family barbecue on Sunday, left around 8:30 that night, said he was driving back to Des Moines. Did he seem upset about anything? Any indication that he might have decided to leave town or change his plans?" "Not that I noticed. He seemed fine when he left." The police asked a few more routine questions, then thanked Robert for his time and hung up. But Robert knew this was just the beginning. Over the next week, the investigation intensified. The police found Danny's cell phone records showing that Robert had called him Sunday night at 9:47 p.m. When they asked Robert about it, he explained that he'd called to make sure Danny had gotten home safely, but there was no answer. They found security camera footage from a gas station showing Danny's pickup truck heading towards Cedar Falls at 10:15 p.m. Sunday night, but no footage of it returning to Des Moines. The police interviewed everyone who had been at the barbecue. Most of the relatives confirmed that Danny had seemed normal during the day, although a few mentioned that Emma had seemed upset and that there had been some kind of tension in the family by the end of the evening. Emma Morrison was interviewed twice. The first time, she stuck to the story that her parents had coached her on. Uncle Danny had seemed fine at the barbecue. She didn't know why she'd been upset, probably just stress from school. But Detective Sarah Chen, who was leading the investigation, was experienced in interviewing trauma victims. She recognized the signs: the way Emma couldn't make eye contact, the way she flinched when asked direct questions about Danny, the way her whole body language screamed that she was hiding something. Detective Chen asked Emma to come in for a second interview, this time without her parents present. "Emma, I need you to understand that you're not in any trouble," Detective Chen said gently. "But I think you know something about your uncle's disappearance that you're not telling me. And I think whatever it is, it's been eating you alive." Emma sat in the sterile police interview room, staring at her hands folded in her lap. Part of her was relieved that someone finally suspected the truth. The weight of keeping Danny's abuse secret had been crushing, but the weight of keeping his murder secret was even worse. "I can't," Emma whispered. "I can't tell you." "Why can't you tell me?" "Because," Emma's voice broke, "because if I tell you what Uncle Danny did to me, you'll know why Daddy did what he did, and I can't be the reason my father goes to prison." Detective Chen felt her heart sink. In her 15 years as a police officer, she'd worked hundreds of cases, but there was something about this young woman's pain that cut right through her professional detachment. "Emma, what did your uncle do to you?" And finally, in a police interview room on a Tuesday afternoon in August, Emma Morrison told the complete truth about Danny's systematic sexual abuse. She told Detective Chen about the months of rape, the threats, the fear, the shame. She explained how Danny had used his position in the family to isolate and control her. When she was finished, Detective Chen sat in stunned silence. She had suspected that Danny Morrison's disappearance was connected to some kind of family conflict, but she hadn't anticipated this level of betrayal and trauma. "Emma, where is your uncle now?" Emma looked up with tears streaming down her face. "I don't know exactly, but I know he's never coming back." "Did your father kill him?" Emma didn't answer directly, but the look in her eyes told Detective Chen everything she needed to know. The arrest came on a Wednesday morning. Detective Chen and 3 other officers arrived at Robert Morrison's construction site with a warrant. Robert was operating a backhoe, moving earth for a new foundation, when he saw the police cars pull up. He shut off the machine and walked over to meet them, his face calm and resigned. He'd been expecting this moment for weeks. "Robert Morrison, you're under arrest for the murder of Daniel Morrison," Detective Chen said, producing the handcuffs. Robert's crew watched in shock as their boss was read his rights and loaded into a police car. Robert Morrison was one of the most respected men in Cedar Falls, a pillar of the community, a devoted family man, a successful businessman. The idea that he could be a murderer was almost incomprehensible. But as the details of the case began to emerge, the community's reaction was complicated and divided. The prosecution, led by District Attorney Michael Crawford, painted Robert Morrison as a vigilante killer who had taken the law into his own hands. They argued that regardless of what Danny had done, Robert had no right to commit murder. The proper course of action would have been to report the abuse to the authorities and let the legal system handle it. The defense, led by attorney Patricia Wells, argued that Robert Morrison was a father protecting his daughter from a predator who had systematically abused her for months. They painted Danny Morrison as a manipulative sexual predator who had used his position in the family to prey on an innocent young woman. The case became a media sensation, not just in Iowa, but across the country. Talk shows and news programs debated whether Robert Morrison was a hero or a criminal. Online forums exploded with arguments about vigilante justice, family loyalty, and the failures of the legal system to protect sexual abuse victims. Now don't forget to like and subscribe to our YouTube channel.